I'll give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. We take note of the views voiced by the UN Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, Madam Kelly Clements, and the Director General of the International Organization for Migration, Antonio Vitorino. We have heard in your statements a large number of alarming conclusions and terrifying figures. In this context, it behooves us to recall that the Russian Federation has encountered the consequences of the deteriorating situation in Ukraine immediately after what took place there in February 2014. I refer to the anti-constitutional coup. As soon as the nationalist authorities showed their real face, beginning unleashing a war against the Russian language and then undertaking the physical destruction of the residents of the East, Russia was flooded with refugees who were fleeing the Maidan lawlessness. According to official reports alone, since 2014, those turning to the Russian Federation for citizenship, refugee status, or temporary shelter was, at the very least, 1.7 million people immediately after the shelling of Donbass by the Ukrainians, immediately before the Russian special military operation. This flow increased considerably and reached 863,000 people. So since the coup at the Maidan, more than at least 2.5 million people have sought refuge in Russia. It behooves us to recall that the mass exodus of Ukrainians from their country is nothing new for that state. According to the data of the Ukrainian Financial Ministry, from 1990 to 2021, the country's population was reduced by a quarter, from 54 to 41 million people. At the same time, according to data from the Ukrainian Demography Institute, in 2021, there were even fewer Ukrainians, 38 million people. It is noteworthy that the number of Ukrainians traveling for seasonal labor, according to that same institute, was 3 million people. I am providing you with these figures not to downplay the scale of the migration challenges that Ukraine has been encountering and which its neighbors have also been encountering. I merely wish to not agree with attempts to erase the history of post-Soviet Ukraine, attempts to turn a blind eye to all of its problems, and attempts to address the situation from the beginning of the operation. Today, our Western colleagues prefer not to mention. Not just do they prefer to overlook the growing rate of emigration from Ukraine, which has gained ground in recent years, as I mentioned, but they also prefer to overlook the staggering corruption, staggering political murders, many perpetrators of which remain unpunished, unprecedented repressions targeting opposition leaders, the mass closures of opposition media outlets, and this list goes on. Those who reproach us of human rights violations fail to recall the unprecedented persecution against Russian language carriers and the Russian language in that country. Of course, while praising Ukraine, it is awkward to talk about the Peacekeeper site, which remains operational and provides the personal data of inconvenient Ukrainians and foreigners who criticize the Maidan regime. Among those whose lives are in this way imperiled, there are also minors. Assessments of this disgraceful phenomenon is something which our Western colleagues prefer not to proffer. Madam President, in painting your picture of the world, you are striving to portray Ukraine as some kind of a pure, innocent white lamb. This picture does not include the 8-year war of the Kiev regime against their own residents in the East, the many years protracted sabotage of the Minsk agreements, and since you are trying to prompt others to forget about this with the threat of sanctions and direct political and economic blackmail. Moreover, having baselessly attempting to portray what has taken place since 24 February as an unprovoked, unprecedented Russian aggression or war of trace, you hypocritically make it appear as if nothing worse transpired in the world since the end of the Second World War. sweeping under the rug the hundreds of thousands of victims since the end of Cold War, victims of the military misadventures of Western states in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yugoslavia, and Libya. Just yesterday, our Syrian colleagues circulated a letter at the Security Council about the horrific consequences of the Americans razing the city of Raqqa to the ground in 2017. This operation was edifying for the inhumane actions which resulted in this city being virtually reduced to rubble along with its civilians. Today, in this way, you are attempting not only to rewrite history in an anti-Russian bent, but you are trying to overlook the role of the USSR in the liberation of Europe and the world as a whole from fascism. In this way, apparently it is easier for you not to notice the egregious manifestations of Nazism in Ukraine, denazification of which is one of the main goals of our military operation. This is necessary to ensure that this soil never again have a threat emanating to other states or the people of DPR or LPR or the Russian Federation. Madam President, it also behooves me to note that the concerns of our Western colleagues about Ukraine and Ukrainians are very short-sighted and egotistical in nature. Today, they are necessary for you merely as cannon fodder in your direct war against the Russian Federation to the last Ukrainian. At the same time, you have your own interests at the top of your mind. The weapons producers in Western countries are eagerly rubbing their hands, calculating their profits from increased demand on military products. After the first week of hostilities in Ukraine, the cost of the stock of the leading British arms producer BAE Systems rose by 24%, and the stock value of Thales Company, which is a producer of anti-tank and anti-air facilities, has rose by 42%. And we have seen the same trends with the U.S. war industry. This is clearly to the liking of NATO, Eastern European NATO members who have long been thinking about how to rid themselves of obsolete Soviet weapons. And they have been giving Ukraine vehicles which no longer work. And they know that the Russian army will grind and crush this non-functional equipment, and they will no longer have to think about its disposal. Not limiting themselves to this, our pragmatic U.S. colleagues, without an iota of conscience, are now attempting to reap the maximum in economic profits in prompting Europeans to engage in increasingly stringent economic sanctions. Washington, which suffers the least of all from this, intends to have other states become addicted to their gas products. The American liquefied natural gas products are considerably more expensive than Russians. And yet this is a molecule of freedom, according to, as was mentioned by a U.S. official, which the Americans will not pay for, but the Europeans will pay for. The Russian economy, as is known, is doing fine under circumstances of sanctions pressure with new areas of development and new reliable partners. The only country that is losing in all respects as a result of the situation is Ukraine. And yet, apparently, it seems that the authorities in Kiev have either not noticed this or prefer not to notice this. And however, ordinary Ukrainians understand this. From the beginning of the special military operations, they have not been encountering terror, nor have they been encountering Russian shelling, contrary to the attempts by propagandists, but they have encountered the ruthless hostility and indifference against their own population that has been shown on the part of Ukrainian neo-Nazis and radicals who have been seeking to save their own skins at all costs. Evidence of civilians being used as human shields, indiscriminate shellings of residential areas in their own cities in order to pin blame on Russian military personnel is an egregious tradition, very much akin to Goebbels' tradition in provocations, and this is seen in the provocations such as in Bucha, Kramatorsk, at the maternity hospital, and the drama theater in Mariupol. And these numbers, such incidents, the list continues to grow with each passing day. It is not possible to sweep the truth about this under the rug. And the fact that the Ukrainian military has been using prohibited cluster munitions in the shelling of residential infrastructure cannot be swept under the rug either. This morning, cluster munitions targeted Golovchina in Belgorod Oblast, where there are no military facilities located. All evidence has been registered. However, a willingness to condemn this heinous crime and the radicals' breach of the norms of IHL is something which, for some reason, we do not see Western colleagues doing. The same radicals and neo-Nazis are openly using our military to seek cover in the Azov steel plant, have continuously claimed that they have had civilians behind them this entire time. And this, despite the fact that they did not report this until yesterday, nor did they mention any civilians, even when the encircled military personnel moved to surrender. And in this way, they once again disclosed the truth. The civilians in that facility were only there to be used as human shields. There's a multitude of such evidence, and we will, without fail, share this with you. But will you wish to hear about this, to see this? For 8 years, you studiously preferred not to notice the deaths of civilians, women, children, the elderly in Donbass, and based on that, we have doubts about this. We are carrying out the special operation not to be for understanding or support from you. It would be naive to trust on your support in this geopolitical game which you have unleashed, where you use Ukraine as a mere pawn in your game. The dirty tricks which you are prepared to utilize for forging a so-called rules-based world order is something which we became convinced of when we saw that the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, instead of monitoring and reporting on violations of the ceasefire, simply spied on Kyiv, handing over to Ukraine information from surveillance cameras for them to adjust their firing positions and targets. A collection of evidence about this very inconvenient fact is ongoing. However, another issue warrants specific attention. I refer to the use by the Ukrainian armed forces of the OSCE mission's armored vehicles. According to media outlets, since late February, Azov fighters turned up in the office of the Special Monitoring Mission in Mariupol with demands for the vehicles' keys to be handed over. They threatened the staff with guns, and ultimately, this was OSCE vehicle was used for those purposes. And one of these vehicles was ultimately found 5 kilometers from the Special Monitoring Mission's office in the Kirov market in Mariupol. Not a single one of these vehicles which were taken were returned to the OSCE. There were similar threats targeting the monitoring mission staff in Severodonetsk in late February, early March. The OSCE leadership was aware of this issue. However, they preferred to sweep this fact under the rug until the last moment. These disclosures undermine trust in any international organizations whose senior officials include Western countries' representatives. I will not conceal the fact that under these circumstances, calls for peace and a ceasefire sound mendacious and insincere, and in practice, they merely point to an aspiration to provide the Kiev nationals and radicals breathing room to regroup, to receive more drones, more anti-tank guided missiles, and more man-pads. And this is an attempt to stage more inhumane provocations and to introduce more fakes about the alleged actions of the Russian soldiers. Such kind of tactical pseudo-peacekeeping calls is something which we will disassociate from a genuine intent to help Ukraine to adopt the real and appropriate and correct course of action. And the sooner this is done by Ukraine, contrary to the inclinations that are egging them on, those who wish to gain profit from the tragedy that has been unfolding since 2014, including the European Union's leadership, which has set aside its masks, the sooner this is done by the Ukrainians, the better for that country. Because in one way or another, the objective of the special military operation to liberate Donbass, to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, and to eradicate the threats emanating from that area against the Russian Federation will certainly be achieved. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement.